Good morning and welcome to the 2020 Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Forum. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to remind everyone to please keep your microphones muted and cameras off to keep the forum running smoothly. Our next speaker is Jennifer Ogle. Jennifer, if you'd please share your screen and begin your presentation.
Hey everybody. Thanks, Leslie. That was a great presentation you gave. Appreciated hearing an update on the program. As I'm sharing my screen, it'll take me a second. I want to make sure I get it right. That's the wrong one. All right, here's the right one. I want to thank you, Leslie, for inviting me to speak today, and also the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership Committee for inviting me here today to speak about the Arkansas Native Seed Program. We've made a lot of progress in the last few years, and I'm happy to share that information with you. As Leslie noted, can you see my screen, by the way? You can't yet, because I haven't clicked share. Can you see my presentation now? Leslie, can you unmute and tell me?
Yes. Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And can you hear me okay? I guess you can. All right. Okay, I'm Jennifer Ogle. I'm the collections manager at the University of Arkansas Herbarium. And from about mid-2018 until mid-2020, I was the coordinator of the Arkansas Native Seed Program. And that's a role I'm still unofficially inhabiting as I give presentations and lead seed collection events and do some outreach regarding the program. All right, here are our program partners. We have 16 partners involved. This Arkansas Native Seed Program is led by the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission with significant support from the partners you see on the screen. We have a lot of state and federal agencies, but also several nonprofit organizations involved, and one for-profit business as well. We have a lot of different missions with these agencies and organizations, but we do have a common goal, and that is to develop ecoregional sources of locally adapted native seed for large-scale habitat restoration and revegetation projects in Arkansas. So it's a big goal, and I'll explain more about what I mean by ecoregional sources and why locally adapted native seed is important. But just for a second, just look at this screen of beautiful plants that I'm showing you. On Saturday, I attended a seed collection event at Cherokee Prairie in the Arkansas Valley, and we collected some of these species, including pale purple coneflower and compass plant and rattlesnake master and Baldwin's ironweed for the Native Seed Program. All of these species I'm showing you are in cultivation through Audubon, Arkansas's Native Project right now. So I realize most of us already understand what I'm going to be talking about on the next two slides, but I think it's important in case we have people who may not fully understand why we use native plants, but I'll go over that pretty quickly. Native plants, it's simple. They provide the best habitat and food for wildlife. They promote biodiversity, so they play well with others for the most part. They provide high quality food, beneficial habitat. And then, as you know, some animals, including the monarch butterfly, require specific natives for reproduction. So their larvae require milkweed to survive. And so native plants are the best for those reasons. And they're superior to non-natives for many reasons. As I said, natives play well with others. Non-natives can become invasive and promote monocultures, so they don't play well with others. What I'm showing you here is a picture. It's probably the saddest photograph I have in my collection. It's a botanist attempting to find a rare plant in a sea of Sericea lespedeza, which here is, all the green is Sericea lespedeza, so it's a monoculture. This botanist had found lowland yellow loosestrife in a previous collecting season, one plant left in this old channel scar along the Buffalo in Newton County, and he was attempting to find it again. Well, what had happened is the landowner had planted Sericea lespedeza and it promoted a monoculture and crowded out all the native plants, most all of the native plants. So it was a very sad situation. And in the case of Sericea lespedeza, it's a special case too, because it was planted specifically to provide food and habitat for the northern bobwhite quail. It turned out that it did not provide good food for the quail. In fact, the quail could not digest the food, and it resulted in declines of the population declines of that species because it was such a bad plant, a bad choice to plant. So that's another big reason why we want to use native plants. What's less commonly understood is why we need to use locally sourced native plants for restoration. One big reason is because locally sourced natives, plants that are from here, are adapted to our environmental conditions, to our climate, to our soils. When we bring in a plant from somewhere like Pennsylvania or Nebraska, you think about the conditions in those places. Vastly different amounts of rain, potentially different soil types, just different climate. And so we think that if we use locally sourced natives, they'll be better adapted to the conditions where they're planted here in Arkansas. There's also a strong genetic component to why we want to use locally sourced native plants. When we bring in plants from another region of the country, those plants are the same species as our local natives, and so they might hybridize. And what we might see is lower reproductive success of their offspring because of that. On the other end of the spectrum, if we bring in non-local native plants, they might have a genetic component that's superior to ours, and they might displace local populations. And when I say superior, I mean they might be more vigorous. They might be able to reproduce more and establish more quickly and take off. And so they themselves could become an invasive species. We call these cryptic invasions because they look like native plants, but their genetic makeup is different, and they can displace our local populations. Now, this is a concern for any native plant, but especially when we're dealing with rare natives in Arkansas. I think of swamp milkweed, which is a rare species in Arkansas and is a very, very popular plant in landscaping in particular right now. And people are bringing these plants, it's very common in the main part of its range north of here in Missouri and north. And so people are bringing in seed from other places. And the concern is that those might be genetically more able to establish and reproduce, and they might displace our local populations of swamp milkweed. So that's just one example. And we think that we have the genetic component of our native plants here in Arkansas might be worthy of preservation. And so we want to be careful about bringing in plants that aren't from here. And so to illustrate that point a little more about why we want to preserve the genotypes of our local populations, I'm going to go into the background of the program, which is about 30 years old now. In 1990, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers announced that they would be building a system of pipeline and canals from the White River in eastern Arkansas into the Grand Prairie ecoregion. And what I'm showing you here is the Grand Prairie demonstration project. You can see this bare ground here. That's one of the canals. And this was just a demonstration area. There are 184 miles of these canals planned throughout this region. And the reason for this project is that they need to pump water into the Grand Prairie to relieve local aquifers. And in all, the plan is that 184 miles of these canals would be built, and about 3,000 acres of these open, gently sloping canal banks would need to be revegetated. Well, the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission learned of this plan, and they met with the Corps and convinced them that they should be using native plants to revegetate those banks. And fortunately, the Corps agreed. They agreed to use native warm season grasses to revegetate those canal banks. And so while they were at it, the Heritage Commission reasoned with them that they should be using local sources of native seed, and the Corps agreed to that as well. It's important for the Corps to provide irrigation into the Grand Prairie because the Grand Prairie is a center of rice production in Arkansas, and it's one of the leading rice producing regions in the country. Just so you can gain your bearings, if you're not aware of where the Grand Prairie ecoregion is, it's this spot here in eastern Arkansas. It's surrounded, it's within the Mississippi alluvial plain. It's different than the surrounding Mississippi alluvial plain though. It's older, it's flatter, and it's higher in elevation than the surrounding plain. And it hasn't seen influence from the Mississippi River or the Big River processes in about 100,000 years. So it's much different than the surrounding plain. And what it has is a thin layer of loess on the top of it, which provides fertile topsoil, and a thick clay layer underneath, which provides a waterproof bottom for irrigated fields. So this region of the state is ideal for rice production. before we settled the area though, you may know this story too, this 1 million acres was composed primarily of prairie and savanna, with thicker forest in the riparian areas. We believe that there was more than 400,000 acres of tallgrass prairie in the region. And because it was such a great place to produce rice and such a good agricultural region, most of those prairies have been destroyed. And what remains is less than 400 acres. And those 400 acres are highly fragmented throughout the Grand Prairie. And so these bright red dots and lines are what remains and what's protected. So this is railroad prairie natural area, long linear east-west running strip of about 250 acres or so of tallgrass prairie. And here's a picture of it here. It's where the railroad used to run, and it was maintained by sparks that were thrown from the train and would light the prairie up periodically. And so the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission took control of it, and they're maintaining it as a tallgrass prairie. But as you can see, it's completely surrounded by agriculture, by development, by roads. Downs Prairie Natural Area is right next door. I believe it's less than 30 acres. So what I'm telling you is these are highly fragmented pieces of prairie. And the importance of the Grand Prairie demonstration project and larger project to these prairies is that, just for instance, the demonstration project itself is only 1.3 miles away from Railroad Prairie Natural Area. And it's also very close to Downs Prairie Natural Area. And so it was a big deal that the Heritage Commission was able to convince the Corps of Engineers to use local sources of native seed to revegetate those canal banks. If they were to bring in seed from some other region, that seed, those plants, could interact with the naturally occurring populations at Railroad Prairie and Downs Prairie and potentially, excuse me, negatively impact those populations over time. So the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff started to grow locally sourced switchgrass as a source of seed for this project. They sourced the seed from the Railroad Prairie and Downs Prairie and other prairies nearby, and they started growing it. And they saw some success with that project. And then in 2010, Audubon, Arkansas became involved, and they were able to expand the operation with what they called the Native Project. And I'll talk a lot about that in a minute, but I want to emphasize the importance of grasslands and remnant natural areas in Arkansas and for this native seed project we're working on. We don't just have tallgrass prairie in the Grand Prairie ecoregion. General Land Office surveyors came through Arkansas in the early 1800s through the Arkansas Territory. They mapped 750,000 acres of tallgrass prairie in Arkansas. We had tens of thousands of acres in the Ozark Plateaus. In the areas surrounding Fayetteville, Springdale, Bentonville, and Rogers, in those flatter areas, that was mostly tallgrass prairie historically. Arkansas Valley, we had, again, hundreds of thousands of acres. And in the West Gulf Coastal Plain, we have some of the best examples of remaining blackland prairie that exist in this region. Now, the General Land Office surveyors mapped what they saw. We know that the estimate of 750,000 acres is low, though, because they only mapped what they saw as they walked their survey lines, and they missed a lot. So they didn't see quite a bit of what was there. And then some surveyors didn't note where they saw prairie. So ANHC estimates that actually that number could be double what was actually written down. And that's just open grasslands, barrens and glades and tallgrass prairies. That doesn't include the very extensive amount of savanna that occurred in Arkansas historically. So grasslands are a very important place for us to focus on for the native seed program. It's where, pollinators benefit the most. These are open places where wildflowers can flourish. And so those are reasons why we focus on grasslands for this program. And the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission has a system of natural areas, and many of these natural areas protect open grasslands and other types of grasslands. And so we use these areas as the primary source of seed for our program. That's one reason. So they have the plants, right? The Heritage Commission manages these natural areas for maximum biodiversity. And we can also confirm, this is very important, we can also confirm that the plants in these remnant prairies and grasslands are naturally occurring. When we target these, we know that they weren't planted. And these are the last and best remaining grasslands we have in the state. And so we target these areas for collection primarily when we can. Of course, these aren't enough. We can't get enough seed from these prairies and remnant grasslands. We have to look elsewhere too. So Leslie mentioned the power line rights of way, and these are extensive, right? And so when we know that there's a naturally occurring population, if we can confirm a naturally occurring population in a power line right of way or along a roadside, we'll collect from those places as well. And this is one of the reasons our partnership with the Arkansas Department of Transportation is so important. On their lands and their easements, they keep records of where they have planted native plants and where those came from. And so if we find a population of plants and we're not sure if it was planted or not, we will just consult with the highway department, and they'll look through their records to tell us if those were planted or not. So it's very important that we use local sources of native seed for this program so that they're best adapted and that they're compatible with naturally occurring populations. So back to Audubon's project. I'm going to talk quite a bit about this project. Because this is the group that is growing seed currently in Arkansas, and they're going gangbusters right now. They're doing really well with it. So in 2010, they started helping to grow the native worm seeds and grasses that the Corps needed to revegetate those canal banks. And they did this through their NATIVE project, and that's an acronym. Native Agriculture to Invigorate Ecosystems is what that means. And they had three main objectives. I should say they have three main objectives. One is to make genetically appropriate seed available statewide. And as a bird conservation organization, they were interested in restoring habitat for grassland birds at a landscape scale. The northern bobwhite, meadowlarks, other grassland birds that they're concerned about experiencing population declines. They want to restore habitat for those species. And they also want to provide pollinator habitat. So the UA at Pine Bluffs began helping Audubon, Arkansas with their new program. They provided outreach to farmers. They helped connect farmers with Audubon, Arkansas, and they helped with providing equipment in the early stages of Audubon's involvement. Now, the primary funding mechanism Audubon uses is USDA funding. And so they've had a series of USDA grants, and there are two primary grants that they have had. And one is the Conservation Innovation Grant, and the other is the 2501 Program Grant. They've also had an Arkansas NRCS grant during the course of their program. The 2501 Program Grant primarily allows them to, or enables them to work with minorities, historically underserved groups like minorities, ethnic minorities, new farmers, and veteran farmers. And so that's a pretty broad spectrum of people they can work with. And so they've had pretty good success throughout the state working with different farmers who qualify. They've also received significant support from partners, including the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, Roundstone Native Seed in Kentucky, the Nature Conservancy, and many other partners. I'll highlight a few of those relationships as I keep talking about their program. So the foundation of this project is seed collection. But before we can collect seed, we have to identify the appropriate sites for collection. And that's where Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission's involvement has been so important, because they provide that information. Their agency botanists know where the plants are, they know where the naturally occurring populations are, and they can provide that type of help. They also provide real-time plant identification support during collection events, especially if they can't be there. Volunteers and team leads can text botanists at ANHC pictures of what they're looking at to make sure that they're targeting the right species for collection. Typically, when we collect seed, the plants don't look the way we have them pictured in our head anymore, right? So sometimes people need help. And so we can text the botanist to make sure they can confirm what they're looking at. And increasingly, we're using iNaturalist as a tool to help aid in that process. So the botanist will go out and take pictures of the plants, and they'll pinpoint their location. And then later in the year, when the volunteers come through to collect seed, they can bring up iNaturalist and that observation and confirm that they're in the right place and they're collecting the right plant. So as I mentioned, collection sites are primarily natural areas, but we also target remnant populations of natives in other places if we can confirm their nativity. The master naturalists are one of our partners on this program, and they've been instrumental in providing volunteers to help collect seed. We also work closely with garden clubs throughout the state, the Arkansas Native Plant Society, and other volunteers, some of whom are unaffiliated and simply want to help, and they see events on social media and they come out to help. When we collect wildflower seed, most of that has been hand collected by volunteers. And so what you see in the top left is the process. We go out and we target one species at a time. Everybody grabs a bag and collecting equipment, and we collect that species, and we bring the bags back and we grab new bags and collect a different species. We do machine collection as well. Audubon has some machines they use to collect, including a flail vac, which is on the left. And more recently, they're using a push combine when they can. And I'm going to show you a video of what that looks like now. I'm going to make sure that the volume is turned down. So it's a loud machine, but I've turned the volume way down, so hopefully it won't be too loud. No, that's not loud at all. I'm going to turn it up a little bit. All right. So this is a push combine. This is Jonathan Young having a grand old time with the push combine at Camp Robinson. And this is the Little Rock Garden Club that came out to help collect. I'm going to keep playing this. It's so fun. So I found this while I was traveling through Missouri. It's an aluminum cart with a paddle wheel attached to the front. As you can see, that's a hedge pruner. The cutting blade is on the front. And so you turn that thing on and you push it through the prairie, and it cuts the stalks of plants and brings them into the hopper. I think Leslie took that video one more time. It's so fun. He's collecting rough coneflower. Look at it, just cuts them and throws them right in that hopper. It's awesome. All right. So that's an inexpensive tool. If you're here today and you have a fledgling program or a small program that's cash strapped, this might be a good option for collecting faster than you can do by hand. And it's only $3,500, I think, is what it is. So not bad. So that's the seed collection process. Once the seed is collected, it's stored temporarily in a facility that's Central Arkansas Water, and the plugs is reduced. And so they send that collected seed to Roundstone, they process it, they analyze it, and they do grow the wildflower seed into plugs, which is what I'm showing you here on the right. These are plugs getting ready to be planted on a farm in Cabot. The grass seed is treated a little differently. It's also processed, analyzed, and cleaned, but then it's packaged as seed. And then all of those plant materials are returned to Arkansas, to Audubon's farmers that are enrolled in the Native Project. And it's cultivated. And it's worth noting, I think, that the seed that was collected, so if the seed was collected in the Ozarks, say at Chesney Prairie, it will be given to a farmer. Those plant materials will be given to a farmer in the Ozarks. So they're planting the seed in the same zone that they collected it in. And so here on the top left, it's important to get that field down to bare soil. So those wildflower plots and grass plots have to be prepped to remove any existing vegetation. And then in the case of wildflower plots, here on the right, drip irrigation and plastic mulch are installed. So here's the plastic mulch, and underneath that is drip irrigation that runs the length of this field. They do about 2-acre plots for the wildflowers. And then they use this water wheel planter. The tractor isn't shown, it's on the front here. The water wheel planter is staffed by 2 people, and they go behind and put the plugs in the ground behind the hole that the water wheel planter has created. And then we have a quality control department that comes in behind them. And on the left here is actually, she's not a volunteer, she's the farmer enrolled in the Native Project. She's a military veteran, so she qualified for this program, and she put 2 acres of her land in the Ozarks into cultivation here. And they're just making sure these swamp milkweed plugs are properly placed within the holes that the water wheel planter created. And so the grass plots are on about 10 to 20 acres. We like to have a larger plot for that. And we don't do rows, we don't do plastic mulch and drip irrigation for the grass seed. They're planted with a seed drill or broadcast. So it's much different. The process is much different. So we're planting species that can be harvested in general. Most of the species can be harvested the year after it's planted. So in the following year, the following fall, the farmers are harvesting their grass seed and their wildflower seed. In areas like the Grand Prairie, where the farmers have large combines and hoppers, they use those machines to harvest the grass seed. It's pretty impressive to see. And with the wildflower seed, much smaller scale, it's generally harvested by hand by the farmer. Sometimes we'll engage with volunteers, like the Arkansas Native Plant Society came out last year, maybe a year before, I'm losing track of time, and helped collect pale purple coneflower for this farmer in the Blackland Prairie region of southwest Arkansas. But that push combine I showed you can also be used to collect these wildflowers in these rows. It's perfectly suited for that. And so all of the seed that's produced, it's a much larger quantity than the wild collected seed at this point. It's dried. Audubon takes it back to their facility and dries it, bags it, and sends it back to Roundstone. And at this point, it's in Roundstone's hands. They process it, analyze, package, and market the seed for the farmers. Audubon is not involved in this part of the project. Really, they deliver the seed, but the farmers are involved with Roundstone directly to come up with how they split the profits from seed sales. And so all of the farmers have opted at this point to work with Roundstone, and it's been a very good process for them. This has been a really successful project for Audubon, Arkansas, and for Arkansas in general. Right now, they have just under 100 acres enrolled in the native program on 11 farms in the Ozarks, Arkansas Valley, Blackland Prairie, and Grand Prairie ecoregions. They have 26 species in cultivation, and here's the list of those. They're mostly, actually they're exclusively growing perennials right now. We would like to add other things to that list. We want to add annuals too. We think that's important to add. They're growing the big 4 native warm season grasses. That's great. We want to add some cool season grasses too to that list. And so we're in the process of, well, we've actually developed a bigger list of target species that we hope to work with too, to add to this number. But their program has been extremely successful. And here's a few pictures. This is the same farm in the Ozarks. This is the summer after we planted it. This is bee balm growing. It's since been harvested. Can you imagine standing in that field with all the pollinators, the butterflies, and especially the bees that are just going crazy over this farm? And here's another view. The slender mountain mint and pale purple coneflower. Slender mountain mint in the foreground here. We call it pollinator crack, right? It's just, they go crazy for this too. And right beyond it is pale purple coneflower. We have a couple species of goldenrod. I think we have 16 species on this little 2-acre plot altogether, actually. And in the background, we have prairie blazing star about to go. It's an impressive site. If you have a chance to visit one, you should go ahead and visit one. We do field trips occasionally before COVID. And after COVID, we will continue. So here's another one, newly planted sawtooth sunflower on a farm in the Blackland Prairie in southwest Arkansas. This farmer, she had been keeping these rows really clean of weeds, but then she saw this plant pop up in the rows. I don't know if you can tell from where you're sitting, that's one of our target species. That's Asclepias viridis, or green milkweed. So she let those grow, and she harvested the seed from those that year. But focusing back on this sawtooth sunflower, here's fall of 2018, and here's fall of 2019. So that's a workhorse species. It establishes quickly, flowers quickly, seeds quickly. I don't know how they harvested it, but they did. Some farmers get creative. This farmer in the Grand Prairie has about 700 acres in cultivation, and he decided to plant native grasses between his corn. So he's using them as buffer strips. And on the left here is switchgrass, and on the right is big bluestem. So that's been a successful program for him. And this is Mr. Wofford. He's Audubon's longest participant in the native program. He grows several acres of grasses, and then a few years ago he put in a wildflower plot. And here he is checking on the progress of his compass plant seeds. So that is the native program, and I am out of time, but I just would like to spend another minute talking about the umbrella program, the Arkansas Native Seed Program that's been going from 2016 to now. I was hired, as I said, in 2018 to coordinate that program, to write a strategic plan, to provide a framework for establishing a program in Arkansas, to develop a list of target species and determine appropriate seed zones, and to determine research needs. Of course, I didn't do that on my own. I worked with the partners to get that work done. And because I am out of time, I can't go in deeply into those things, but I'm going to skip ahead to this. We've made a lot of progress on this program. We've determined what the demand is for seed in Arkansas. We've developed our seed zones. We have a list of about 85 target species that we're interested in growing. But we need to do more. We need to develop demand, train volunteers to collect seed using established protocols, such as the Seeds of Success program and Project Wingspan. We need to develop our own program for training volunteers. We need to create stores of seed so that we can act quickly when there's a rehab need. So we need to develop seed storage sites that we can store seed for the long term, and when a need arises that we can act quickly. And then we also need to increase the genetic diversity of our existing seed mixes. So that involves collecting from more sites than we're currently collecting from as well. So there's a lot involved with that program. That could be its own topic, I think. And so if you do have any questions, my email was at the beginning of this. I didn't put it on this final slide, but it was at the beginning of the presentation. I'm going to click out of this so you can see it. And I will stick around for a while if anyone has questions in the chat. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions in the chat as they may arise.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was a wonderful presentation. There's a couple that I think you can directly message, but one that I'd like to include in the recording. How can homeowners get locally sourced plants?
Okay, there are a few places for locally sourced plants, and most of that is going to be seed. Actually, you know, the Arkansas Native Plant Society has a list of resources on their website. We're in the process, I'm on that board, and we're in the process of updating that. And we should be noting which nurseries have locally sourced plants, because some of them do collect locally and only provide local plants. But you can go to Roundstone Native Seed. They have a website, and you can find native seed, at least, sourced from the Audubon Arkansas Native Project for sale through that company. Also, Hamilton Native Outpost in Missouri has some Ozark sourced seed. So if you're in the Ozarks and you're looking for that source of seed, you can contact them. Missouri Native Wildflowers, also in Missouri, obviously, they source their seed from Missouri. And so if they can tell you it's from the Ozarks and you're in the Ozarks, then that would qualify too. We're really working to increase stores of native plants, but we're just not there yet. And so Roundstone has small quantities of seed, but I would recommend you call Roundstone instead of look on their website, because some of the quantities they have are too small to advertise on the website. So if you just call them, they can provide you with a list of what they have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. There's a couple questions in the chat box, and I will post those on social media, or you can email me for the answers or shoot Jennifer an email. It is jogle@uark.edu. And I'll post, or you can reach out to the partnership's Facebook page and I can put you in contact with her.